Okay, so we're going to document this for some reason. This is very, very important. This is none other than Clark Jones. He's a cousin, a direct cousin of a man by the name of Earl Clark Jones, not Clark Jones. He calls himself that, but his real name is Earl Clark Jones. Earl Clark Jones, of course, comes from Frederick, Maryland. This is Clark Jones. This is the cousin of Earl Clark Jones. Now, this is strange because he appears a little bit dodgy in some of the photographs, but also this took place in 2019, believe it or not, right before everything started to erupt around Moab, Utah. So that's Clark Jones. This right here is Melody Pangman with none other than Tina Clark Jones. Now, Tina Clark Jones is the direct sister, of course, of Earl Clark Jones. Although they tried to kind of cover the tracks of that. This is her in an area very, very close to Moab, Utah. We're going to talk about this for just a minute at least. Here she is visiting different areas like the Salt Lake City International Airport, Outlets Park City, Cafe Rio, and another place that's actually in Florida, near the Monroe Lake. And that's going to be a video for another day. Tina Clark Jones is essentially Earl Clark Jones' direct sister. Here's some of the trip that Mrs. Tina Clark Jones took with Robert Jones. And essentially, that would either be Robert John Jones, who's their direct brother-in-law, or the other Robert Jones, who works with Robert John Jones. Now, we're talking about the three different people who are a part of the same family. So we need to keep this tracked carefully here. Tina Clark Jones went with Robert Jones to Salt Lake City a couple of times on the trip. She has several different friends in common with, of course, Earl Clark Jones. This is Tina Clark Jones and her husband, essentially, right there in, a trip right next to Moab, Utah. Correct. There's Tina Clark Jones and her husband in Idaho Falls. On this trip, she was supposed to have been there also with Earl Clark Jones, although that's, not been confirmed. It has to really be looked into. Here's Tina Clark Jones again. And there's Tina Clark Jones, not Laundrie or anyone like that, at Signal Mountain, right by the Grand Teton National Park. That's correct. Now, this is essentially Tina Clark Jones hiding her identity, basically, is what that is. Christopher Clark Jones, who murdered someone in Australia brutally. He was a teenager, and they found the head of the victim. This is Tina Clark Jones, not Earl Clark Jones. Although, interestingly enough, her husband looks a lot like Earl Clark Jones. This is Tina Clark Jones on another trip, retracing the exact area, in Moab, Utah. Here she is by the arches with her husband. Here they are again, arches in Moab, directly next to where everything occurred, interestingly enough. Here they are on one of their earliest trips. But they do have some trips that go back a little bit further. They say, I think Utah is my second favorite state I've ever been to. New York was the first one. You can see that if you look very carefully. So again, Earl Clark Jones is from Frederick, Maryland. That's correct. There they are again, Moab. So, whoops. Yeah. Tina Clark Jones, certainly a suspect. So is Earl Clark Jones at this point in the actual murders. And they do, of course, know Bertolino as well directly. Very important to document for some reason. This is Robert Jones. And I believe he tried to hide the identity, but it's Robert John Jones. That's correct. Robert John Jones is important because he works and has worked for a long time at the Moab Country Club. That's correct. Same Moab Country Club, that's kind of a golf club, 8 minutes away from the, of course, Woody's Tavern. He's gone to Woody's Tavern quite a bit. That's the license plate for Robert Jones once again. Here's just one of his friends or something in that picture. Because he attempts to hide his personal information every single time. That's what he's been doing. Robert Jones has friends that are in common with Tina Clark Jones, such as Bill Jones, of course, family members. Another one is Karen Fallon. That's all for now. Thank you. Just for a moment and just speak about it. This is essentially what is known as the Moab Country Club. Moab Country and Golf Club. It's a total of 8 minutes. Only 8 minutes away. Very important. I'm going to document this last part here as well in this video. These are friends of Tina Clark Jones, to be exact. Something a little bit messed up with the family, because Earl Clark Jones and Tina Clark Jones are directly related to Christopher Jones in Australia, who was the serial killer on the hiking trail. That's correct. This is why it should be paid very close attention. Tina Clark Jones is officially a suspect, I would say, at this point. She has some interesting connections and total of one friend found so far in common with Mark Bertolino, and also another member of the Bertolino family. Here's Tina Clark Jones once again at Grand Teton, and then we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Here's Earl Clark Jones. Okay, at the Woody's Tavern, yes, but the Woody's Tavern of Colorado. Also document this because it's very important. This is Tina Clark Jones after all of the nonsense that's been going on with Moab. This is her driving back to Moab, Utah, essentially, on a trip to Moab, Utah, with her husband and most likely with her brother. And she is at the Arches once again. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up right now, to kind of square off the end of this video that'll be directly related to Kylen and Crystal Schulte, as well as the Schulte family in general, is now things are starting to come together in a very real way, where it appears because we can't say until all the investigation is complete. But it appears that Tina Clark Jones and Robert John Jones were involved in the actual murder. And Laundrie and someone else were made to appear like they were, involved. All they did was switch something, at the campsite, and that was it. Tina Clark Jones, and specifically her brother, Earl Clark Jones, because there's an earlier trip where they also go back to Moab, which is quite bizarre. And the eyes just have never been right about any of this. Earl Clark Jones specifically. They appear to be involved in the actual homicide of none other than the Schulte family. Now, Earl Clark Jones has a habit of going and visiting, for some reason, Lake Monroe, Florida a lot, which is near where one of Bertolino's law offices are. And there's someone who travels there still being very heavily looked into. But it's very, very possible that Jones, meaning Earl Clark Jones and Tina Clark Jones, were the ones who actually murdered the Schultes. And of course, Robert John Jones is somehow involved in this escapade because he's no more than 8 minutes away from the same place they were working on the same nights they disappeared, and is a very creepy looking person. If you look at Robert John Jones and look at his pictures, which is their brother-in-law essentially, he looks very strange. He looks strange, just like Tina Clark and just like Earl Clark Jones. He looks and appears exactly like that. So that's all for now. They are suspect. Now, at this point, I can say that they are firmly suspect in the possible murders. And also, which is still being looked into very, very closely, they knew Bertolino, of course. They also knew Mark Bertolino. So once again, folks, this is just a quick video to kind of go along with that. I wanted to explain just very briefly why this is so important. As much as I've always been a fan of the theory that maybe Laundrie killed the different folks in Utah, around Moab, and also elsewhere, I'm beginning to strongly doubt that, because our real objective is to get all the evidence and all of the facts. And the Jones brothers, there's an awful lot of evidence and also circumstantial evidence pointing directly towards the fact they may have indeed been involved. And also they're connected apparently because one of the Jones brothers carries a long rifle, we found out, because there's more evidence that hasn't been shown here quite yet. Mr. Earl Jones, in this case, you might say, he is connected to some missing hikers, including Shenandoah Park. Yeah, very sad. And so, that's a whole different video that I'm going to go into a little bit more. I just wanted people to understand, we can definitely officially say that, the Jones brothers are indeed suspects in this. And they go back a very long ways. These people are like 57, 58 years old. So there's been a lot of circumstantial evidence. Nothing that would be a smoking gun quite yet, but a lot of circumstantial evidence tying to the disappearance of these hikers in Wyoming and Montana, and also, of course, South Carolina, because that was one of the favorite places that he went to, and he has a friend in New York State. So, I'm just going to point out they are officially certainly a suspect. And there's a lot more to cover. I'll have to go into a different video on other key aspects of this case too. Thank you.